Craig, welcome back to This Is Horror. Andrew, welcome to This Is Horror.
Thanks so much for having us.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it is a pleasure, and we're primarily here to talk about the Handyman Method and what an absolute trip of a book that is. There is so much going on thematically. There are some really visceral scenes that I think will give Chuck Palahniuk and Guts a real run for his money. We're going to get into that imminently, but before that, I want to know, how did the two of you first meet?
Andrew, this is normally this is the part of the minuet and duet that we run together that Andrew handles, so I'll let him do that.
Yeah. I was reading Craig back when I was in a warehouse, working at like a liquor warehouse on night shift. And I read a short story collection he had called Rust and Bone, which is probably like 2005. And yeah, I was like, oh, this guy's a Canadian and he's a writer. Oh, that's so cool. And then, went off on my own way. And then years later, when I had a short story collection coming out, I noticed Craig Davidson had this book coming out called Cataract City. And, I was very young and stupid. So I was like, I'll just email him because we both have books. We're the same. And I was like, hey, can I send you my short stories? And he was like, yeah, I guess. And then I did. And he eventually did get back to me. And he was like, well, my wife read them and I read them and we both like you. So you're okay. Like you're safe. We met up for a drink. He invited me to a Christmas party and then uninvited me like 2 days later. And then, because he wasn't allowed to bring guests. And then, and then we sort of became friends that way. We started playing cards with some other writers in Toronto, but we didn't really work together on anything for probably 8 or 9 years. Like, we were just friends who knew each other, who knew each other's writing. Craig would read my manuscripts, tell me to keep writing, that kind of thing. And then he came to me one day and he was like, hey, we should write a short story together. That would be fun. And I was like, oh, okay, if you say so. And then he was like, whoops, I just had a second kid. I can't write anything with you right now. I have to focus on that. So a year later, I was like, do you still want to write a short story? So this is a very long, convoluted way to be like, we were friends for a long time, and then we just decided it would be fun as friends and people who respect each other's work to write something. And I came to him with this idea of a haunted handyman YouTube channel. And Craig was like, all right, let's do it right now. And one thing about Craig is his work ethic is absolutely nuts. So we just pounded through a draft of a short story and kind of got it out there. So that was kind of the origins of that. It was just, knowing his work, him knowing my work, us kind of coming together. It did feel really natural, but it's also, if you've been hanging out with a guy for 8 or 9 years, you hope it would work. It doesn't always. Like, Craig and I have both had experiences of trying to collaborate, and they're your best friend or they're a great guy. But I literally once had a guy leave me up a tree in a story. Like, I came back to the story and the character was in a tree and there was a bunch of dogs around the bottom. And I was like, well, I can't do anything with this. I'm sure it could have, but it was just a perfect metaphor for like collaborating doesn't always work. But it felt really natural and normal with Craig to kind of create these worlds together. So that's the long version of the story, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was quite a risk for you to send these stories almost unsolicited. At least you sent a kind of pre-email where you were like, do you want the stories? But yeah.
No, it was a very arrogant and bold thing to do at that age. I don't think I'd be brave enough now. I think we also I'd asked some writers too. I was like, oh, is this Craig guy cool? And they were like, oh yeah, he's cool. Just say, like, it's fine. You'll be okay. So I kind of had some pre-warning that, it wouldn't be the end of the world. And he could have always ignored me too. He's pretty good at that.
I don't ignore people, but I ignore obligations sometimes, and checks that show up, or not checks, but bills.
Yeah.
At least before I got married. But no, people I don't ignore. But I mean,
No.
I think there is that certain like brazenness. I remember when I was a young writer, Chuck Palahniuk, who you just mentioned, came to Calgary, and I had Rust and Bone was coming out, and it had arcs or whatever, and I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I really liked Chuck, and he was an influence of mine, and so I just showed up at the reading and went through the line wherein most people are buying a book, and I'm like, oh, I came with a book for you. And maybe you'll read it, and my source whole spiel was like his first book, Fight Club with Norton. Rust and Bone was coming out with Norton. Sort of, we weren't with the same editor, but it was brazen. Looking back, I'm like, this is a deeply brazen act to do. But you're young enough, and you're sort of bold enough, and you're determined enough, and you are not really sure of maybe the right or even respectful way to do things. Not that I'm saying that Andrew did that, but like I'm just like, well, how else am I going to get this opportunity? It's not going to come around again. So you just sort of take these opportunities and risks, and obviously some of them don't work out. But with Chuck, it did, and obviously with Andrew, it led to like not only a long term friendship, but this collaboration, which, as he said, started as a short story and mutated in many ways from that point.
Yeah. And I will say, I did not open with, and we should write a book together. That would be that took about a decade to build up to. That
Yeah.
short story collection was 2013. So we're here in July 2023. It's been a bit of a trip since then. Yeah.
Yeah. So the message for starting writers is, if you contact another writer, you might be collaborating with them in a decade. Probably doesn't normally work out that way, but it's a
Sometimes the seeds,
possibility.
seeds take a while to germinate, but you never know. And I think too, I know Bob and Michael, like when you're starting out as a writer, I feel like it's very much like I've been approached by fledgling writers at readings, and there's a weird sense. I really truly believe that they're like, if you take my manuscript, which sometimes they come with, it's like, well, you'll just go to your publisher and you'll walk through the door and you'll say, all right, you'll slap it down on the desk and say, let's start with 100,000 copies. I want this out the door. I want it printed. Like as if we have that, sort of ability. Most of us are working hard to get our own books published, but again, you're young and you're just not sure how the machinery of publishing works. So it probably feels to a lot of writers like this is a viable possibility. Like if this person likes my work and he or she champions my work, then that's the entree that I need. And you can't disabuse them of that. It's just something that they'll learn as time goes on. But like, I usually admire the determination, at least that comes with that kind of entry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. And I mean, as Andrew has illustrated with the whole being left up a tree analogy, I mean, a lot of collaborations and a lot of partnerships don't necessarily work. And I feel, I mean, when finding someone to collaborate with, you need someone who has enough in common in terms of the writing style and aesthetic, but they also need to be distinct and different in some way. Otherwise, you might as well have just written it on your own. So, what were kind of the qualities that you saw in each other that meant that it was a good partnership, that you could complement and contrast in terms of styles and what you're bringing to the table?
Andrew, you or me?
I mean, I'll start. I guess I can start with that. Yeah. I think the thing with Craig's work generally is there's like a depth and breadth to it that I don't really find in a lot of other modern horror writers. Um, there's a generation now that I kind of do, but for a while, like I think Craig was the one guy who like had read everything, the good and the bad, and he had taken the good stuff out and he had filtered it and found the gems and kept them. And a lot of that's coming from me when I'm reading his work, from like, obviously there's the King foundations that everybody has, but guys like Clive Barker who are not afraid to get gooey and weird and upsetting and really bodily. I think that's something a lot of people say about the Cutter books, right? Like they are very visceral. They are very, I don't think they're quite as extreme as some people think they are, but I think Craig has a way of like creating characters and then putting them in these visceral bodily situations that make it hit harder. It's not just, oh, this guy's head got cracked open. It's like, hey, you just got to know this guy for 10 pages and now his head got cracked. Like there's an impact to a lot of the body horror and the other things he's doing. I think the Troop has a lot of that. And so I think, you know, for me, that's the stuff that really sticks out and maybe is different from what I do. And it is also somebody who really is tapped into, I mean, especially I've been thinking more and more about it as going back to Handyman and also looking at the other stuff, Cutter stuff, like how much of Barker is in there. And I want more people to see that, I guess, because I feel like that's somebody who really, when he was up against it with publishers and stuff, Barker was very like, well, this is what we're publishing. This is my work. This is the visceral reality I want to share. And I'm hoping for like a resurgence in that. And I've always kind of found that to be part of Craig's work. That isn't necessarily in mine, but is something that I really respect. So that's kind of where I guess I see Craig's influence coming from.
Yeah,
and
and I feel like, and the way that we sort of work, and because you're very right, Michael, is like what are the dualities in your writing styles or your fixations that kind of can bounce off each other in really interesting ways? Ideally, I suppose, and you never know, right? You can like a person and you can admire their writing, and then you wonder how that friction is going to work on the page. And there's not too much evidence of writing collaborations. Screenwriters do it a fair bit, but writers, I think of obviously King and Straub did a couple books together. Skip and Spector were big in the I guess in the mid '80s or late '80s. I can't. After that, it kind of goes a bit. I don't know, Bob or Michael. You can think of anyone else in the horror sphere who does it like consistently, or I'm not quite sure.
What's his name? Armand Rosamilla. He tends to do a lot of collaborations that I've noticed. I know Alan Baxter has done some as well. Not so much lately, but in the past, he has like a whole series that he's written. But yeah, I mean, you don't really see it, and you're right. It's more in screenwriting. It's but it's interesting. It's interesting. I think we should have more collaborations. You have to find the right people to click with.
Yeah,
That's the key.
That's exactly
we've been
it.
talking about.
You don't know. You don't know until you actually get there in the crucible together and start trying to work through these, problems that every novel, cracking characters, essentially cracking how to sort of tell this story. But I mean, what drew me to Andrew, I think all the really, like, I've said this before, I think I say it in the afterword. I think like the galvanic, big brain ideas in the book come from Andrew. I think those are the fruit of his imagination, and I was fortunate enough to sort of be gifted some of those things that I wouldn't have come up with if left to my own devices. And so I saw my role in that case was to work with the gold that Andrew had fruited of his imagination. And so I think that's what really worked. If anything, I suppose, as Andrew said, I'm sort of, well, I wouldn't say encyclopedic. It's not that, but I certainly have read a lot and sort of understand I think the trappings of horror and how to like kick a story along. Whereas Andrew has, some of these ideas that I haven't seen before that feel really new to me. And so that's how I see our collaboration. And on top of that, there's obviously the shared, sort of sociological stuff that I think we were trying to work our way through. We're obviously from different generations. Andrew's at least 10 years younger than me, so we're coming at it from slightly different vectors generationally. But I think, men are men, essentially, and some of the things that are male hangups were probably back to the Piltdown days when we were banging at rocks with sticks.
Oh, yeah, I think so. And I mean, I wonder for Andrew, why was this story, why was, the idea of a possessed YouTube channel, why was that the idea that you wanted to collaborate on with Craig? I mean, was this an idea that you'd had for a long time and you needed that missing ingredient, and it happened to be that Craig was the ingredient, or was it something in this particular subject matter, or was it more, hey, that's the the next story idea on the list? Why not bring Craig in for it?
Yeah. Honestly, I think it was that it felt right for Craig. Like it was something that, sort of seeing, I guess, a lot of Craig's earlier books and the things like they're dealing with masculinity, whatever else. And, but they're often about, failure and not being able to succeed, or being, jammed up in your life, and, that frustration. And I felt kind of some resonance there. And this YouTube guy, like my idea of this pleasant handyman sort of character. Craig has this sort of like affect sometime where he does kind of feel like he fell out of time. Um, he has sayings and things like, "Oh, my good fellow, my fine fellow, how are you?" Oh, geez, he's just got this sort of, he's 10 years older than me, but in some ways, it could feel like he fell out in 1955. And then you parallel that with his day to day life, where he's also this very kind guy who's very raising his kids and being really supportive of the writers, but also his own man, and committed to what he wants to do. And so I was like, okay, so we have daytime Craig, who's a wonderful guy, and then we also have Nick Cutter, who comes out at night. And I mean, that's kind of who Handyman Hank is in a way. Like Handyman Hank is this guy who's your friend. He's going to help you out, but he also has some things to tell you about how the world works, man. And you're going to get real with it, brother. And I think I thought Craig could really bring that to life, because I think he's seen that duality, and I think he and I are both able to walk on both those sides. You go to a literary event or festival, and you're shaking hands with everybody else, and then you go back to your hometown and you got to deal with the shit kickers in the neighborhood or whatever else. So I think Craig, to me, would understand that. He understood sort of that duality and those two sides, and that if we wanted to explore this almost like algorithmic possession, right? Like you go on YouTube and you're like, oh, I'm going to watch a fun video about this car, and then 7 videos later they're like, and other cars are going to turn you into a frog. Like there's quickly you end up in like conspiracy land, or you end up watching Warhammer 40K lore videos, or so. Like you just end up spiraling into crazier things, and you're not even pushing buttons, you're just letting it happen to you. And I felt it would be a good matchup there. So and I think I was right. Like I do think if I want to write kind of specifically about these dudes who just can't handle the world changing around them, Craig sees both sides of that and is able to kind of provide some direction and also some grounding too. I'll be like, oh, and then this will happen. And he's like, okay, but no one cares yet. We got to make them care about this. And he's very good at making people give a shit about the characters in the story, even when they are terrible people. So yeah, that to me was a project that I thought was for Craig and me. It wasn't something I'd worked on by myself. And I felt pretty confident about it when I did bring it to him, that, okay, you want to work together? Well, this is what I think we should work on. And that's kind of how it went. Yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is that it started off as a short story, then a novella, then a novel. So, I mean, maybe, Andrew, that was actually your original intent. It's like, right, well, Craig's not going to agree to a novel, but he might agree to a short story. And it's like, oh no, look what's happened. We happen to
You
be
walked me
writing a
down the
novel.
primrose path. You
Yeah,
just walked me right into that
you
one.
gotta be subtle, man. You gotta slowly winch it in. Yeah, no, I think the story started honestly because we were like, oh, let's just do a story as friends. We'll sell it to a magazine. That'd be fun. And then we showed it to some people, and you get used to agents or other people being like, well, this sucks. Like, bye. And instead, people were like, this is like, we want more. Like, don't just have this be a story. Like, please, we want more. And it took a lot of thought and a lot of work to take it beyond that. And we were working with really good people who got it. Like our editor, Ed, he was one who was like, he kept pushing us, and we were like, okay, Ed, if we do this is a novel now. And he was like, yeah, okay. So maybe we got tricked there.
Yeah.
But
Trickery everywhere.
Trickery everywhere, Michael. But yeah, it was this thing where like the ideas were all there from the start. Like a lot of the concept and most of the pieces were there, and it was fleshing it out, which worked well. And also, I think we wanted to write something that was succinct. It only has 4 or 5 characters. It is this sort of tight thing. Because, I had just written a novel with like 20 points of view, and I was like, all right, no, I need to do something that's just straightforward. Still crazy ideas, still gross, still fun, but let's like keep it in the family, if you so to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love how slow, like in a good way, the transformation of Handyman Hank from just this like almost innocent, like he's your older brother and saying things like, well, if you're going to shave your balls, you better not use an electric shaver. And it's like, well, he ain't wrong. Don't fucking do that. But then soon things are getting sinister, they're getting obsessive, violent, and then the climax is like, oh shit, this is so that it's so organic, this transformation. And I mean, it's exactly as it would be and kind of as it is when you're getting sucked into these like algorithms when you're just watching a video. So I mean, was that something you had to go over a lot to get it just right, because the pacing is spot on?
That's a good point, Michael. I would say too, just me and Andrew have done a lot of these, and it reminds me of the last time you asked very good questions that are good springboards and good places to sort of jump off and talk as intelligently as I'm able to about some of these things. So yeah, I think the progression was important to kind of get it right, and to me, it reminds me of I find that I think I tend to agree with people, even though I don't agree with it. But like, say if I'm in a position of like uncomfortability, or where somebody else is kind of de facto in charge. Like one time I went to get a haircut, and the guy's halfway through the haircut when he starts being, Trump's got some good ideas. Let's just lay it on the line here. This guy has got some really good ideas, and I think anyone who has half a brain would agree with that. And it's like, I mean, what am I going to do now? I mean, you're sort of forced to be like somewhat in agreement, I mean, it wasn't like I was like, you're right. Can you show me your, can we go to a MAGA convention together? It wasn't like that, but you're sort of like, I'm kind of at this guy's mercy. So like, you don't say what you would really rather say, because maybe you don't want to provoke an argument with essentially a stranger. I never went and got a haircut there again. And it would be the same if you're like in a cab and the cab driver sort of has a similar type of argument, and you're like, I mean, I don't want to argue. And some of it's just simply that, like, I don't want to get to an argument. I'll just sort of like let this play itself out, and then I just won't, I'll leave without him knowing how I really feel about the whole thing. But I think there's something in the Hank, say Trent interaction that has sentiments of that. Is like, if you don't say anything, if you don't express yourself, if you allow another person's point of view to sort of wash over you, without sort of fighting back or expressing your own opinion or saying what you really feel, which I think is strangely a thing a lot of men and women do, then you sort of you know that haircut ended and that cab ride ended with that person thinking that they were right and that I agreed with them. And in a way, that means that they kind of won just because I wasn't willing to sort of have that out with them. And now I argue with cab drivers all the time. just I just start yelling at them immediately. But you know what I mean? It's sort of like, I do think sometimes I have actually, because of those experiences, actually had arguments with people who I'm never going to see again, but because I can't live with the idea that they would go away thinking that I was in agreement with them just because my sort of like lack of interaction left them with that belief, right? So I think there was some element of that with Hank, in that Trent just sort of slowly gets beguiled and pulled into his orbit, and for his lack of really like interaction, sort of passively accepting the things that he says, he's ultimately cinching the neck, the noose around his own neck, and getting pulled deeper into these things. And of course, it doesn't hurt that in some ways Hank is kind of speaking his language and appealing to the sort of, I don't know, sort of neutered, sort of, sort of male inadequacy that Trent is clearly feeling right from the start of the novel.
Yeah, it's interesting to, consider what to do in these situations that we've all been in when somebody starts like giving their spiel, their worldview, and you completely disagree with it. And I mean, typically, I guess just because like time is finite and I used up a lot of arguing with people I disagreed with in my 20s. I kind of just think, well, if I don't think me expressing my opinion will in any way change theirs, then I generally don't say that much. I might say, I hear what you're saying, but I disagree with you, and then leave it at that, because it's an awful lot of energy to put into a fight or an argument that is ultimately, when you walk away, you're both going to have exactly the same point of view. So I try to think about, what do I think um the ultimate outcome is going to be, and that strategy seems to have worked quite well so far. I mean, I've actually had conversations with, like, there's one person who voted Trump in the first election, and then we had these conversations, and I convinced them not to vote Trump in the second. Now they didn't vote for Biden, but they didn't vote for Trump. They voted for some third party. So to me, that was a positive outcome of that conversation. But most people, it's like, this is my view, nothing is going to change it. And it's like, well, what's the point now? Obviously, you've made a good argument. The point is for them not to walk away thinking they were right. But if I just say I disagree with you on that's the minimum effective dose, as Tim Ferriss would talk about. It's like, right, I don't agree with you. That's that. But I'm not going to get angry. It's like, look, since we last spoke, I have gone through a divorce and a custody battle. So, like, so many things now, they just seem so trivial. It's like, look, if you want to get me angry, try harder. Why don't you fucking take my kid, and then we'll have a conversation? But at the moment, it's just like, I'm going to be passive about it because you're not worth my time.
Yeah. See, I'm a little bit different.
Oh yeah, Bob is very different.
But I'm at the point now to where I'm kind of like Michael. It's like, there's a lot more, there's bigger fish in the sea. And, occasionally, and I have to deal with the public on a daily basis. So, you get all kinds of people, and occasionally you get somebody you're having a pleasant conversation with. They're going to say something with, something that you completely disagree with. And what I've learned is that instead of arguing with them or anything like that, I just basically just, I really have lately been taking more of a passive approach and say, hey, I really don't want to talk about that. I'm glad that you do, and I'm sorry that I don't want to, and I hope that you're not offended, but I just don't want to talk about that. And especially if I'm trying to like close a sale, I'm not gonna, it's like, oh, well, you're a maggot. Okay, never mind. Yeah, then I'm gonna, hey Bob, you got a pretty bad survey, and I'm like, I don't care. They were a piece of shit, So I want to be able to kind of diffuse a situation like that. And outside of work, I've found that that's even easier in situations. It's like, hey, I don't want to talk about this. I just don't want to. And which is a lot different because last year I would have blown your ass up about stuff. So but it's like Michael said, there's bigger fish in the sea. There really is. There's more pressing issues in our lives than that.
Yeah, you're both correct, and I agree with you. And it's rare that I get into these type of arguments with strangers. I save that for my family members. We get into no, no. I tend not to get into them. It's weird though. Maybe it's pandemic hangover or something. But I do find my temper rising weirdly over certain things, and I think maybe it is again. You tend to write about things for all sorts of reasons, but some of them is to reflect these sort of weird feelings that bristle through you from time to time, and how can you investigate them through a fictional lens, and maybe find a way, to sort of talk about them without, talking about them in the quotidian way in which they occur in your own life. And I mean, I think YouTube is a part of that too, because it's like it's a one way sort of conduit, and if you're watching a given individual, then if he or she is sort of presenting a certain point of view, I mean, you sort of just have to receptively take it, because there is no way to sort of talk back to that person, and then you're choosing obviously what channels to watch, and what kind of morality to sort of to accept passively. And that's, in this case, that's what Trent is doing, even though in some ways he has little choice in it. Well, I don't know if I'd say that. Maybe Andrew, maybe he does have choice in it, but it's speaking his language. Let's say that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely tapping into a root that's there and letting it flourish instead of, pulling it out. I think there's, ways where, you are kind of, I mean, I remember when I was younger stuff too, where it was just like you can kind of get spun up in someone else's worldview if you're not paying attention and you want to fit in, or you want to be, live up to an expectation. And I think that's sort of what, a lot of the effective ways of doing that, especially in Hank's case, is you keep moving the goalposts of what those expectations are. You keep upping the stakes, upping the ante, sort of goading. And that happens in some, male friendships. That even happens with my brothers, is if we're going to see who's going to eat the most cake, it's like, but just sort of this, like, you keep trying to almost stretch the limit. And you see who will follow you, when I used to work in the liquor warehouse, sometimes we'd have guys telling stories about, the craziest things they did. And, people keep escalating and escalating. And then someone would tell a totally offside story and the whole thing would fall apart and shut down. Because it was like, oh, they went too far. They didn't lure you along the path far enough. But on the flip side, there were guys who, tell you a story. Oh, I went home with like 3 girls on the weekend, whatever. It's a lie, but you just say, instead of getting mad, because a lot of guys would get mad, they'd want to flip a table. I would just say, that's so cool, man. That's amazing. Wow. Tell me more. And just let them dig a hole, let them incriminate themselves. Wow. And then you had how many shots of whiskey? Whoa, that's amazing. Because, you aren't going to win just calling them a liar. You need to show everybody just how ridiculous they are. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to, or what we ended up doing with Handyman Hank, is it starts off reasonable, right? He's going to show you how to fix a crack in a wall, and you need that help. I mean, I prefer the videos that are like a minute long. I just want to see the actual thing that I'm doing. I don't want a 5-minute intro like, well, what's the history of a toilet? I don't care. I just, how do I make it flush? But, you know, Handyman Hank, you know, every video, like you said, Michael, is like he's pushing a little bit further. He's pushing and he's pushing, and then we get to like a crazy place. And that's, yeah, I think that radicalization is there, especially as Craig said, when no one's pushing back, right? Yes, there's comment feeds. Yes, there's like, you can write back, you can do live commentary. Like, no one's going to read that necessarily. I mean, most creators, I think over time, you just don't even read the comments. At some point, you're like, I can't deal with this. So it is this sort of like one-way conversation that eventually kind of brings Trent in our story to a very dark place where, you know, he knows something's wrong, but he can't, you know, tell which way is up anymore. He just keeps digging down.
Yeah, and I think the last time that masculinity was explored so brutally and so honestly was, sorry to keep bringing him up, but Chuck's Fight Club. And it's almost impossible to have a conversation about masculinity without at some point referencing Chuck. But I mean, a big part of this as well is like the relationship that Trent has with his wife Rita. And I mean, a lot of it coming from the fact that he perceives her to have like a better job and status, and then obviously, you know, he's not working at the moment because of an incident, let's say. So I mean, do you think a lot of men in society at the moment are still kind of suffering from, I don't even know really how to put it, but I guess like a fragile ego and confusion as to what it is to be masculine, so that if, you know, the woman in their life does have a better status or a better car, that this is a real threat to them. Do you feel that this is more a generational thing, a class thing? You know, these are broad strokes to have a good old conversation about masculinity and the potential toxicity of it.
Andrew, why don't you go first? There is a lot to unpack here, which is fun to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. I think like, yeah, for us, I guess the foundation of it was that these roles have shifted in a good way, in a way that, you know, I think is positive and is, you know, in the long run beneficial. But there's still these after effects lingering, especially for women, actually, where it's like, oh, now they're supposed to do everything. But that there are a lot of men who, even if they're professing extremely liberal beliefs, you see this a lot where it's like, you know, they want to tell everyone how feminist they are. And it's like, well, what are you doing action wise in your life? Like, you know, the number of guys who've, you know, been busted in the last 10 years for, you know, being these great advocates and yet treating women terribly behind the scenes, it's kind of huge. And I think a lot of it comes from like not being able to fully like let go of the past, to not let go of like the imagery and the father figures and the whatever else. It's kind of like guys driving gigantic pickup trucks and yet they work a white collar job and they've never put anything in the bed and they probably have never used the 4-wheel and they haven't towed anything, but they have all the chrome on there in case the day comes. So sort of like this gesture towards something that doesn't even really exist anymore. And I think that's there's that little bulb in the brain that's still left. That's like, well, it used to be like this. And it's like, well, it's not anymore. And it wasn't that great when it was. I mean, did you want to like break your back on the line, you know, 40, 45 hours a week, whatever it would be? I don't know. I think what we ended up exploring, I guess, is somebody who loses those signifiers, like his job and other things. And there's no core beyond that for him. He hasn't really defined himself through his relationships and his actions as like a man. So he's desperate to find signifiers that show that. And I think that's what you end up seeing a lot is people who, you know, no matter what they stated politics are, if their level of comfort is disrupted, if their, you know, expectation of how they see themselves is disrupted, you know, they lash out. I think that's a big part of it. I think it's like this, the world has changed, but how we're basically sold things like masculinity maybe hasn't. You know, it's often the fact that, you know, some people want to buy a dude wipes instead of face wipes. You know, it's just this idea that like, oh, there's a secret man way of doing everything. And there's not. I think it's also this idea too that there's going to be this really strict dichotomy between what women are like and what men are like, and that's fake. That's not real. All that does is sort of keep people separated. And yeah, Handyman Hank leans into that really hard and lures Trent into that. So we wanted to explore that and we wanted to play with that. And really kind of focus too on how much of that really, I think, comes down to insecurity, a lack of foothold, right? A lack of sense of self in place. And so when you don't have those things, like whatever wind comes by and picks you up can carry you to some pretty bad places. So I don't know, Craig, if that's close to where you were going.
That's better than my standard boilerplate, a lot better. You know, but yeah, I mean, exactly. It puts itself in line with, as you said, like a lineage. It has its own horror lineage, Handyman, but within the lineage of like masculine sort of, not masculine fiction. Fiction, I think, that grapples with sort of. It's weird because Fight Club. I think Fight Club is arch. I think Fight Club is written by someone who is really thoughtfully trying to unpack masculinity. But if you go back to like Deliverance, you know, James Dickey, you know, or if you go even back even further to Iron John, I mean, that's someone who's trying to tell people like, you know, man, you need to go back into the forest and light fires and unleash primal screams, and you need to reclaim your masculinity that has been lost. You know, back then it would have been, you know, by having a white collar job and not getting your hands dirty anymore and not understanding, you know, if you're lost in the forest, which side of the tree moss grows on, and God forbid you're going to get eaten by wolves because you don't know these, you know, things that a man should know. So it's like this, you know, it's been around with us for as long as I said, as back to caveman days. Certainly when the bigger guy came and threw the littler guy out of his cave and said it was his. So obviously we're exploring that. And as Andrew said really eloquently and better than I can, you know, my feeling of this is I look at my own growing up, and you know, it was a classic 80s upbringing, for better or for worse, you know, which is my dad went to work and my mom worked, but like if a transfer happened, we would all pack up and go because my dad had to go off and his job was paramount, and my mom would just sort of find something to do in whatever new city we went to. And I've said this before, but and Andrew's heard this a few times now, but like I asked my mom while I was writing this, like why was that it was just so acceptable to you, or maybe not acceptable, but at least you sort of put up with it, for lack of a better word. And she said, you know, when you were a kid, Craig, your father and every other father on the block would go to work, and then later every mother would come out with their kids and take them to school. And it was like you would look up and down the block and see people living the same lives as you were. And that sort of homogeneity to everything made it feel like this is just how it is. And obviously over time, women have said, including women of my mom's generation, is like, well, fuck this. Like, this is not the way that I want life to be. And who says these are the rules that we all have to follow? And yeah, I think men of my generation, I use my generation because that's just the one that I'm most conversant with, have a really difficult time coping with that, specifically with the excellence of their wives in a lot of cases, or partners, you know. And, you know, I even me, partially because of my, and I want to be very honest here, like because of my job, I'm home all the time. That's part of my job. So with our children, and my wife works at a hospital, she needs to be there 44 hours a week. So if one of our kids gets sick or someone needs to get taken here or there, you know, I stay home. I'm home anyways, but like I am home with the sick kid. I am not getting my work done. If someone needs to be chauffeured somewhere, 90% of the time I'm the chauffeur. And this actually strangely, it hurts my wife in a weird way because she feels in a strange way because of her own upbringing and the way that she was raised, that she's not being the mother that her mom was. And yet I feel like I'm not being the father that I saw my dad being. And so we both have these moments, I think, of like, your fingernails are digging into the palms of your hands because you're just frustrated and vexed. And it's not really based on any kind of coherent argument or rational upset. It's based on, as Andrew said, comparing yourself to past iterations of men and women and feeling that you are failing somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the things too that you really captured in here is this sense of competition, and whether you're competing with your spouse or you're competing with your peers, especially like in the scenes where where Trent goes to he goes to the I guess the Home Depot to get his stuff. I've been there. And I go there on a regular basis because there's things that I have to fix and stuff like that. And I've got no shame in my game. It's like, hey, how does this work? Explain it to me like I'm fucking 5. Because if you show me a toolbox and tell me, hey Bob, get this screwdriver out of here, it looks like this, I'm going to stare at it because I don't know what you're talking about. I see tools and I have I guess a form of dyslexia. I hate to use that word, but I can't see the tools in the toolbox. And I've always been like this. So when I go to these places, I used to feel very, very out of place. Because I just, was told at a young age, hey, you need to pay people to fix it because you're going to tear up something. You're trying to change the oil in your car, and I'm going to have to remove the oil filter for you because you done ripped it in half. So, that was my dad. So that's my life, So that sense of competition, it's ridiculous. There's absolutely no need for that. Yet I feel I tense up when I pull in the parking lot to these places. I have to get something that I need to fix at my place. And I'm like, damn, I hate even going in here. Because there's going to be that guy that's like, hey, you're in the wrong line, And it's like, fuck you. There's your competition. But yeah, y'all captured that. And I felt that. It made me tense when I was like, oh man, this is not going to be good. This is just not going to be. And of course, as we go through the story, it ends up being a lot. It's like, well, it really didn't turn out very good at all for somebody. I was like, holy shit. Wow. But yeah, y'all took it to the limit there.
Well, you think too, like as inadequate as you feel in those moments, and I do, and Andrew too, because Andrew looks like he knows what he would do. He's got the beard. It's all a put on. He can barely hammer a nail.
It's true. It's true. And I just stand there and look semi-threatening. Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the tattoos don't mean nothing. Yeah.
I mean, but those same guys walking into an accountant's office or a lawyer's office would feel that same kind of inadequacy on the other side, because that's there's so few people who have like sort of that polymathic ability to sort of do all sorts of things. Most of us, left brain, right brain, we're good at one thing and we might be adequate at another, but often we're completely inadequate. So there's places on earth where we feel immensely comfortable. And there's places where we feel like out of place. And so you're right. A lot of the, I think the book was exploring, is centering in on your own inadequacies ultimately, or that was part of my process. And then, torquing it up as high as you can and making it as uncomfortable, to the point of satire almost a little bit. Oh
yeah.
But that was the idea. So yeah, I think I wrote that scene, but I think it was Andrew's idea. I wrote it, like Saturday guy and all that. A lot of the
Yeah,
lingo
no,
is
Saturday
Andrew.
guy is an insult I heard once at Home Depot, where a guy was like, "You're just a Saturday guy. Like, you got it." Not to me. I was there like, "Yeah, you're a Saturday. Jeez, what? I'm at least a Monday, Tuesday guy because it's less busy then." Uh, but yeah, no. I think there was a few things that we talked about before we did it too, where we were like, what do we want this to be? And just the entity of the Saturday guy is a type of guy. I think, it's a good to know your types of guys. In Ontario, like where Craig and I both grew up, it's sort of the center of Canada, unfortunately. Sorry, everyone in Vancouver. There is sort of what I call, there's this character. I'm going to write about him someday, but I think he's sort of reflected in this book too. There's this like mythical fuck up known as Buddy over there. And Buddy over there is always who you blame your problems on, or who did the job wrong last time, or who doesn't know what he's doing. And so, Buddy over there got a bobcat and he was digging out his own trench and then he flipped it and now no one can rent the bobcat because he broke it. Or Buddy over there put in a new septic and now it's backed up so the whole neighborhood smells like shit. Like, Buddy over there is just this guy who's always fucking up. And, he's never quite named, but he's always around and he's always potentially fucking up your shit. And I think there's some of that in there too, that like, you don't want to be Buddy over there. That's like the mythical figure who's, he's sort of like a gremlin. He's kind of, oh, the lawnmower's not working because Buddy over there just decided he was not going to put gas in it. So you're always kind of, that figure is sort of lingering. And I think those mistakes are lingering. I mean, I was hanging curtains in my house and I had to do the holes twice. And I was like, well, everyone's going to see this and I'm a fraud. And I was like, oh no, I can cover them up with the curtains. Boom, problem solved. It's all good. But, we had we brought things in from our life. I think Craig was getting rid of skunks at one point.
Poorly.
I mean, you succeeded. I had squirrels in my house. We get a lot of wildlife in Canada. And, I had to get, I had multiple squirrels. I was like, all right, I'm just going to hire a guy, and they got him out.
One you could have dealt with, but multiple. They had
one I would have been like, well, I got a bat out of my house by myself. That was fine. But, squirrels, they're just rats with fluffy tails. Yeah, I mean, they will eat through aluminum, man. If they think their baby's on the other side, they will crank right through it. So, sometimes you have to bring in the person who knows what they're doing and who's also been on a roof 100 times. I don't want to go up there. So you find, people with the right skills. And I think, being okay with that, versus making it your quest in life, that's part of kind of what went into the book is like what happens when you can't just admit that the squirrels might be too much. So we don't have a scene in this book where a bunch of squirrels attack a guy, but maybe in the next one. Because they really, if they catch an artery, man, it's a bad scene. Those teeth are sharp and they go deep. So you gotta be careful.
Which one of us got him started on squirrels? Who was it? I should have been a writer in the interview.
Yeah, Craig's
don't,
like,
don't pull the ripcord on the squirrels.
Yeah, on the squirrels. I'm just saying that's where a good root of this comes from. But yeah, you're always going to kind of come up against something you've never seen before, and you can pretend you can handle it, or you can kind of acknowledge where your weaknesses lie, I guess.
Yeah, and as a side note, nobody brought up squirrels apart from Andrew. He fucking segued into that himself. He was like,
we just need people to know, Michael. It just has to be out there in the universe. People just need to know. It's a PSA in the podcast.
Yeah. But I mean, obviously, we've mentioned the Saturday guy, so it's apparent that there's some real comedy in this. Of course, for want of better phrasing, the ass crack L wife sex scene, as I've dubbed it in my notes, that is hilarious. And so, I mean, I'm wondering, was it always your intention to write a book that was as hilarious as it is horrifying. And if not, once it became apparent that there was going to be a lot of comedy, how conscious were you of that balance? And I mean, in terms of just making sure it was tonally what you wanted to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think there is. I wouldn't even say me personally. I think there is a close correlation between satire and horror, and like you just you wrench it far enough that sort of it can blur the line, sort of, and I even like say with the troop or even with some of my early books under my own name. I remember writing like for Rust and Bone, I wrote like a dogfight scene that I think went on like 5 pages. And you sort of say you're almost writing in a state of like anxious hilarity at that point because you're like, no one's ever going to publish this. Like this is just it's going too far. But that kind of giddy feeling of like being on a razor's edge of something that you're not quite sure how to define, but yet you feel like you're going too far. You're on the event horizon of something. Um, that is more vanishingly rare as I get older and as I write more. And so if I can write my way to that point and find my way there, however that is, you know what I mean? Whatever it is to say going too far. And as Andrew said, I would like to hope that like as much as I love like say splatterpunk or really really hard edged horror, I don't. I mean, it's strange. You self-identify or self-see things the way you want to, but I guess as rough as the stuff that I write is sometimes, um, I've read stuff that has been so much worse that I just sort of see my stuff still as tame. I mean, not in comparison to sort of like a gothic ghost story, but on the range of scale of what horror sort of holds. So, you know, I guess I see like going really far in a horror scene, sort of a really visceral horror scene, or going really far in a satirical scene. They give me the same level of kind of like personal joy as a writer. And I guess, now at 48 years old, you write to entertain yourself sometimes. You know what I mean? You write to sort of make yourself laugh and make yourself sort of get that high feeling, and you're chasing that high to a degree. And whatever gets you there, really. And you hope other people like it, because I would never want to write to alienate other people or just for my own self-satisfaction. But sometimes I've discovered that in trying to get to that place, and luckily so often you get through the eye of the needle and you actually get to that place, often a reader kind of enjoys being in that place too.
Yeah, and I think for the comedy aspects of it, I mean, for me, masculinity on its face is already such a ridiculous concept, and like such a like it's always full of like guys trying really hard and failing, which is funny. Just generally. And then it is sort of like layered with like if you are a YouTube personality, how do you take yourself seriously? You can't really. So there's that performative aspect. And like a lot of this was for me, influenced by being up late and you're watching Adult Swim, and what you're going to get hit with is all kinds of stuff, whether it's too many cooks or unedited footage of a bear, those kind of things. Like those are like, okay, you know what? This is funny, but also deeply disturbing. And so that's where a lot of this came from for me. And I told Craig that as well. And I had him watch a couple, and we but it went in a very different direction, which I was glad with. Like those are kind of like, you get that inspiration. You're like, oh yeah, that kind of level of uncomfortable is funny, but is like teeters, like Craig's saying, on that edge of plausibility, of, absolute, you're sort of almost numb to it eventually. You just keep pushing it and pushing it. And so that to me was always going to be there. I mean, it's very hard to do something about, video content without it kind of being ridiculous and at the same time horrifying. Like so much of the last 20 years of a lot of horror writing has been like creepypastas and things like that. And like so much of that to me is located in a deep discomfort with technology and a deep discomfort with like the potential of technology. And yet half those stories, again, and this goes for ghost stories too, you read them out loud in the broad light of day, it's silly. So context and sort of shaping the narrative really matters. Horror and satire are on the similar dial. And yeah, like Craig's saying, depends where you crank it. But I thought we had a lot of fun with it. Like that was, and I hope that came through. We were, playing. And I think that's the best thing you can do, especially when you're co-writing. It's like you toss a serve up and you hope Buddy just hits it right back at you. You want to have that back and forth. You want that energy coming out of it. There are times I would get an email from Craig with a new draft and a super long email about it. And I would just respond to the email like, yes, one. And then I would, I'm so excited about what he's given me. I'm like, oh man, this is the video. Okay. Like let's push that further, like, this is what we're doing. That kind of sense of, there is a sense of joy to it when you have a good collaboration, and that's going to come out in the humor because you're excited about what they're doing and you want to up them, you want to like push it to the next level. And then Craig will do something horrifying and disgusting. And I'll be like, okay, now we need a quiet scene because I'm not going to top that. So I just cut to outside the house. I don't, so, those moments, you learn when to pull back too. So yeah, I think if anything, it came from the collaboration and you're almost trying to like entertain the other guys so you can keep writing the story.
Yeah, there is a certain irony that even through the writing, there was this competition and this one-upmanship that you were both, participating in. So given the story and the themes itself, I love that happened.
Yeah, that's a good callback there, Michael. You got us. Yeah.
But I mean, I know that we're coming to the end of the time that we have together, but we haven't even mentioned yet Milo. And so that there's like a whole generational thing in terms of like the men being affected by not only masculinity, but like this kind of algorithmic possession, as we've coined it. And I mean, when did you know that Milo was going to become part of the story? And tell us a little bit about the creation of Blue.
I can talk. I'll let Andrew talk about Blue because that's his creation, as well as Handyman. But Milo came along in one of the iterations. Again, the short story was, as I recall, we'd have to go back to the file, but it was just a guy out in a house out in the middle of nowhere that was, again, looked on YouTube, found this thing, and it drove him gradually insane. And then I think we sent it to my film agent, and he was like, it was essentially needs more meat, I think is what his general global note was. And so, to me, again, I'm a father and, a husband, as is Andrew as a husband. And I'm like, to me, meat now means domestic. It means sort of bringing in more people and bringing in, because I'm not sure that we could have necessarily stretched the idea of a guy out in a house out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I guess you could have, like House on the Borderlands or something, you could have found a way, but I guess my mind didn't go there. I immediately, so essentially like my son, while I was writing it, was 10 or 11, which is Milo's age. And, there was some of that, as I think I said earlier. I try and find syntheses to my own life. And then like, the thing that the character is thinking. Now, I'm not saying that a lot of the stuff that Trent thinks mirrors my own thought patterns, thank goodness. But there are some things certainly. And there's a certain sense of like familiarity with that group, and when we first started writing or talking about it, we had a daughter on the way and sort of, similarly to in the book as well. So a lot of it, bringing into the domestic sphere was just me wanting to bring it into a place of not necessarily my strengths, but at least my familiarity. But then Blue, Andrew.
Yeah, I think Blue
First, he was going to call it Blue the Squirrel, but I said,
I would
cannot do that. I can't let you do that.
Yeah, no, I was overruled. No, I think Blue, is definitely, I mean, just the avatar of a children's show that sort of is in that realm of like the uncanny, where you're like, you end up seeing, I mean, it's been talked about a lot, but, I was haunted by seeing my nieces or nephews or cousins where, 5 YouTube videos in, they're just watching Spider-Man, Elsa go to mall and funeral. And it's like, who made this content? You see those videos out there now where it's just like computerized heads spinning in toilets singing. Like, kids will just respond to stimulus. Even Baby Shark is like its own. So just almost something mindless, but then also something that is like a little bit of a throwback to like a Wonder Shows in kind of era of comedy, where it's like, yeah, if you have a puppet can get away with a lot more than a person. And a puppet can kind of lure people into a false sense of security. And so Blue is sort of like this other version of Handyman Hank a bit. It is a kinder, gentler, but creepier Handyman Hank, who is on sort of a weird spectrum, of his videos don't need to make as much sense because kids don't care. And he's also omnipresent and sort of appearing in more and more places, which I found with like Baby Shark and other things too, where like I was like, no, this was just an annoying video. Why are there birthday cakes now? Why are there balloons? Why is it like, and Rita's sort of experiencing that in the story too, where Blue is all of a sudden everywhere. And how quick those sensations happen, and how sort of like flimsy they are, it doesn't really matter because, the kids are enjoying it in the moment. So, yeah, I think that's kind of where it came from in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So we're going to have to break the the fourth wall or the kind of kayfabe here.
Yeah.
So, Craig has got to go in a few minutes. Do we have a minute for a brief detour into another subject, or shall we wrap it up here?
No, I have one more question for me, for sure. I think Andrew could stick a bit longer, but
yeah, let's do one more
will.
for Craig. Like, let's do one more and then we're good. Let's do it, Michael. We'll just go. And if Craig's got to go, then we'll go. But I think he can do one more.
Yeah, totally.
So,
yeah.
Let's do it.
So another thing that obviously we spoke about before is that, to a certain degree, we're all victims of algorithmic possession to some extent. Now, is that something that you are both very concerned about? Are there things that you have put in place? I know, Craig, that you're actually not on social media much at all. So let's just talk about how this affects your real life.
Well, I feel like we might have spoken about that last time, way back in 2018, and I remember that question coming up. I'm not quite sure how I answered it then, but probably similarly to the way I'd answer it now. Like, I think I said it very honestly. I think Little Heaven was coming out, and I was on Facebook at the time, and very quickly I was scrolling down, and there was someone who wasn't even out yet, and someone had read the book and had posted a very honest but very like painful for me to read on the cusp of that book coming out, like belief in the merits or lack of merits of that book. And it made me realize, like, at the time I had like whatever 2,000, 3,000, friends, quote unquote, but like it made me realize how many of them I actually knew, and how many of them in my old fuddy-duddy sense of friendship were really my friends. Like, I didn't mean that as like, oh, what, how could you do this? I thought you're my friend. It's not that at all. It's just a sense of like, I guess I thought I was getting into it potentially initially as not a platform at all, as a way to sort of maybe catch up with old high school friends or people I hadn't seen for some time, and maybe reestablish relationships in that way. And it became what it is and what it's really good at being, which is a way to meet a diverse range of friends, often within, say, a genre or a certain sense of like a fascination, a shared fascination. But I realized that like I have a hard time staying friends with the few friends I do have. You know what I mean? Like the friends who I have in real life. I mean, I feel like life gets away from you, your responsibilities compound, and it's hard just to get away and find time with like an old high school friend, or even, we try and play poker, me and Andrew, and it's amazing how many times we just can't get the group out because people just have busy lives, right? So I think in a way, yes, I was not particularly interested in getting blindsided by things like that. That was a small part of it, but a risk that I guess I didn't see the use running. But secondarily and corollary to that, it was like I think I just wanted to like maintain as many of my friendships as I could, in the real world. You know what I mean? And sort of set aside time for that. And I think in doing so, I lost a lot of opportunities for like really good friendships that could have transpired online. You know what I mean? I'm not against it. I think it's a really great vector for human connection. It just wasn't the sort of vector that worked for me. But I know Andrew, for example, like you've had really good fortune with like meeting people online and fostering really good relationships.
Yeah, but I think that also like there is sort of, as we were talking about earlier today, sort of there's this there can be a little bit of a distance that you create, like I post a lot of my dog so that I don't have to post myself, and I love my dog and people love seeing my dog, so that helps. But also, like places like Discords and things that are a little bit more friendly than just open air stuff like Facebook or Twitter where like anyone can comment. You do kind of need to protect yourself or know, that it's not real in a way, and that it is, a lot of it is parasocial or, but to leave the door open. I mean, I'm also from a younger generation where like I was on forums and things and I had, friends that I did make online. And I think being honest about those relationships is good. And also limiting, knowing that you don't have to respond to somebody, that you don't have to follow back, that you don't have to participate if you don't want to, and you don't appreciate the interaction, while still leaving enough room for deniability in the middle is important. I think those kind of parasocial relationships can happen, and they sometimes can feel really overwhelming. Like a lot of people think they know you, right? Or they think they've experienced you. And sort of just having an internal barometer that says, okay, that's too much. I'm going to divert this, or I'm going to slow this down, or I'm going to stop this. And I'm sure you both get it too a lot, like with the podcast and with, the amount of people who are putting out horror who are like, do they want something? Do they just want a favor? Or do they actually care about who I am? That kind of thing. And that's a very real experience and part of sort of putting yourself out there. And so it's learning how to create those boundaries as best you can, without getting paranoid. And and I think, yeah, with Handyman Method, we were like, okay, no, let's get paranoid. Let's push it to the limit. But yeah, I think like a lot of what Craig is saying is true. And it's almost like you have to build up defenses to kind of survive those ways. And and sometimes too, when life is happening, you just don't have time. I have time, or I make the time, but I'm also pretty strategic about, post 2 or 3 things a day. That's it. Or post. I'm not one of these guys every day who's like, buy my book. Like, no, like with the Handyman Method right now, I'm like, hey, this book influenced it. It's pretty cool. Check it out. Oh, check out this movie. And that's it. There's a way to have some authenticity out there without, just being a foghorn saying, my book is out in 2 weeks, and if you don't buy it, you're not my friend. So I think walking that line takes a lot out of you, and I think both you guys have experienced that. And that's the weight of it. And it is a weird modern weight that, previous generations, maybe just had to deal with the church ladies talking gossip, and marking out whose cars were in the lot and whose weren't on Sunday worship. So there's a little bit of that. And it is that idea of being like surveilled, right? Like surveillance and community surveillance. And, maybe we'll write another book about that at some point. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both for spending such a lot of time chatting with us. This has been awesome. There is so much more we could have spoken about, but I hope that our listeners are intrigued enough to go out now and to buy the Handyman Method, or you don't even have to go out. Just order it online. You don't have to leave your home. And we didn't even have time to talk about the brutality in the scene with Milo and Morty, and that alone is a reason to get this book. So there's a little appetizer for you all. But yeah, we should definitely do this again sometime. And I kind of hope that this won't be the last that you two collaborate as well, because you got some magic on the page.
Well, thanks, David and Bob. These are, I remember the last one we did, and when we heard that this one was coming up, I told Andrew, like, these guys are wonderful to talk to, real supporters of the genre, and really thank you both very much for making the time, and it's really, we're grateful.
Yeah, we were very really happy to be on here and chat with you too. So thank you so much, and yeah, happy to talk to you guys again sometime soon.